All right, the last formal class. Right? Isn't that amazing? Like, doesn't it seem like I was here at the second meeting, right? And then it was all very brand new, and now you've been doing this all the time, right? This is your like regular Tuesday, Thursday thing. and you know so much stuff, right? That you just had no idea how much, right, you could learn in a few weeks. And the other really important thing to know is that this place is full of people who know things, right? So you can talk to almost anybody here, probably anybody here, and find out things about the canyon and things about nature that you didn't know before. And they can talk to you and find out things that they didn't know before. And that is just one of the most beautiful things about this organization, is that everybody, you see all the expertise of so many different docents standing up here in front, right, teaching docent training. And you are us, right? We are us. Okay, so this is Ecology II. This is where we wrap up all this information that you got all through docent training, right? You learned about the birds and the herps and the mammals and insects, right? And how to present this to kids, and you're starting to practice how to present this to the public. And we're pulling together the pieces here and wrapping it up, making sure that we get the humans in the story here in Ecology II. Now, this quote, so if you remember from Ecology I, scientific study of homes, that's what ecology is, right? It's a scientific study of the habitats of living things. All right, so and we remember, like, this is part of our habitat, but it's other organisms' habitat too. Right, so we're all interacting here. And this quote from John Muir explains why we continue to study ecology. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And you can pick anything in the park or anything in your life, and you can trace its connections to other people, to other places, right, to other living things. Let's go on with that some more. Now, so I want to go through some of the ways things are connected, and the ways that the ways things are connected, and some of these processes that we kind of say all the time for docent training, but maybe a little bit brush over what the actual definitions of them are. Right. So the first one I want to talk about is adaptation. Right. So you probably have heard all through docent training that this or that organism is adapted to this climate, right? That it has it has this characteristic that's an adaptation to make it drought tolerant. Heard anything like that? Heard it 100 times? Went, oh yeah, that's means it fits here, right? It fits here. Okay, so for example, right, the two leaves of the coast live oak, right, are, there it is. Okay, I pushed the wrong button, of course, because Ron gave me, there's only, he warned me, and there are not a lot of buttons here, but I did push the wrong one. Okay, so adaptations, the real definition of them is that they are genetic traits that help a living thing fit into its environment. It's important that they're genetic traits, right? They're inherited traits, traits passed down over generations. And this then touches on a problem that people sometimes have about, well, let's back up first. What adaptations does this acorn woodpecker have?
The pointed, sharp beak.
Has a beak
A
for
strong
eating?
tail, so it can be
So it can
support itself when it's pecking.
And it's adorable, so people don't get really angry and yell at it because it makes so much noise.
That's true. That I think that helps a lot, especially if you live in a wooden house. Okay. It has this coloration. It has this nice coat on the outside of feathers that the water runs off. It also communicates and insulates, right? It has, like, once you start looking at something, almost all of its traits, you can find a way that they are adaptive. Yes?
Also, I read that, talking about biomimicry, they studied woodpeckers' heads in the construction of helmets.
Yep.
How with all of that wrapping and that shaking of the brain is it protected? And
Yep.
here's what they found in woodpeckers' heads.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's adaptive plus it's biomimicry.
Yep. Yes. So you can study an adaptation to an environment and find ways, or a way of living, and find ways to apply that in human technology. Very good example. We used to have a display of exactly that in the old museum way back. And, that's a great example. Okay, so where do they get these adaptations? What's the process of getting genetic traits that are passed down over generations?
Evolution, sexual selection.
Selection. So they get selection. By selection, they evolve traits, right? The traits evolve. They become more pronounced over time. And evolution is sometimes a word that triggers distress among people that you're talking to, right? Because there's this feeling that evolution, if you're saying something about evolution, you're saying their grandmother is a monkey, right? Which is not helpful to understanding our life here in the canyon. Okay? And it's not what it means. Okay? What it means is genetic change in a population over generations. Genetic differences in a population over generations. Right? That's the scientific definition of evolution. So, that just means that, over generations, some traits are favored and some traits aren't. And I don't see any reason why anyone has any problem with that. So here's a quick explanation of this, an example that comes from research that's been going on for decades in Central America with these guppies and cichlid fish. So guppies, anyone ever had guppies? Why do you have guppies? Why did you have guppies? What is characteristic of guppies?
They reproduce.
They reproduce like crazy and they have beautiful colors. Okay? And they're very hardy. It's easy to do experiments with. Easy to keep them alive over many generations. Right? So if you're looking for genetic change over generations, guppies, great, because you can get a lot of generations really fast and you can see traits that are easy to identify, like coloration. So coloration could make them more attractive to predators, right? Coloration can also cause camouflage, right? Which you've also come across in docent training, right? Camouflage, coloration that makes you blend in. And then there's coloration that makes you stand out, right? And those of you who had guppies or know about guppies, which ones are the colorful ones? The males or the females? No, you're not sure? Okay, it's the males. The males are colorful. Like the birds, right? But the males show up more, right? So it's the male guppies that are very beautiful, like birds. Okay, so in these experiments, they had pools, right, separated by little streams where the small fish could move, but the big fish couldn't. Or they'd block off a stream and make it so the fish that stayed in that pool, that were in that pool, just stayed in that pool for a little while, for a few generations, because guppies have generations of months. And in places where there were a lot of predators with big eyes, visual predators, there was high predation. And where there were no predators, or only predators that hunted not visually, but by smell or by movement, there were over time, so this is months, this is a year, over a year you can have a lot of generations of guppies, and over that length of time, where there were a lot of visual predators, the guppies had fewer spots, right? So, and where there were no predators, the guppies had more spots, right? So there must be an advantage to having spots, right, where you show off and reproduce more, except for when that's counterbalanced by there being predators that can see you, if you are a guppy, right? So this is an example of observing evolution, right? So the argument that you have to believe in evolution or not believe in evolution, like, don't even go there. It's observable. Okay. So, and it's not threatening to anyone's identity. Because, right, there it is, right here in the world, and it doesn't say anything about your people. It just says that over time, population changes to fit what's there, and that can be inherited. That the genetically determined traits that are favorable at one time, right, can be passed on at a higher rate than things that are unfavorable. That's all. So that's evolution and adaptations. Evolution is the process of getting those adaptations that you have heard about all through docent training. Okay. Another thing you might have heard of docent training is symbiosis. So this says symbioses, that's plural, yes, for a thing that ends in is and is derived from this foreign language. Okay, there are specialized ways that things live in or on each other. Symbiosis. All right, so do you know what this is in the picture here?
Is that daughter?
It's daughter. What do you know about daughter?
It's a parasitic plant that saps all the nutrients from other plants.
So right, gets its nutrients from other plants. So this is a plant you might see here. It is parasitic on other plants, and actually they can sense what the nutrient content of other plants are. So it's based on greenhouse experiments where they planted the daughter between pots of other plants, and they would always make their way toward the plant that had higher nitrogen content. So if the plant was nitrogen starved, they would ignore that one and go to the other one. So keep in mind the plants are smart. Okay, so this parasitism is a kind of a symbiosis, right? That the daughter lives on another plant, and once it's attached to the other plant, it can't live without it, right? So, and it's a case where the host plant subload is damaged, right? That some of its nutrients are redirected to the daughter, and the daughter benefits, right, and grows using the nutrients of the other plant and the water, right? So that's a kind of parasitism, is a symbiosis. Okay. So mutualism is another kind of symbiosis. That's where both partners in the relationship benefit from this close relationship. Okay. Most of the time when you hear people say symbiosis, this is what they mean. Right, parasitism technically, but mostly you mean that both partners benefit. Okay, so an example that is highlighted in the interpretive center in there is the relationship of the yucca and the yucca moth. That the yucca moth distribution depends on the yucca plants being there. right? Because they lay their eggs in the flowers, and there are some, little, a little looseness on the edges of the population where sometimes the yucca plants are still okay, but they're not pollinated or possibly pollinated by something else. But in most cases, the yucca plants are pollinated by the yucca moths, right? So the yucca plants can make their seeds because the yucca moths are there. Yucca moths depend on the yucca plants to grow their babies. So, right, that's a very close relationship where these two species that are not closely related to each other are closely dependent on each other to continue their generations. Okay, so that's mutualism. Another kind of mutualism is lichens. Another example. So we have a lot of lichens in the park, and they're looking really beautiful with all this rain. You see them much more. Lichens are a combination living together of a fungus, an alga, and bacteria, right? That need each other to live on the surface of rocks and trees. The fungus gets food from the photosynthesis of the algae, and the algae get protection from drying out inside the fungus. So even though the lichen holds water when it gets water, and then it dries out, but it has protective chemicals so that it stays alive when it dries out. And the alga that's in there also stays alive inside the fungus. So the lichens can dry out completely, and then when they get water again, they can come back, and the algae do photosynthesis, make food, and they both use the food. So that's an example that you'll see all the time here, lichens. And lichens are a mutualism between unrelated things that live together for their mutual benefit. Okay. All right. Beautiful picture indicates a transition to another concept. Okay. I'm going to mark that by walking over here. Okay. So another concept that has come up is, I'm sure, over the course of docent training is recovery. It's natural systems recovering from some kind of disturbance or problem, right? And the discussion of whether ecosystems can recover or not. So we normally think of something like a fire. This is a fire in Malibu. Right, the fire comes through, knocks back like all the living things in the area. Right, this has happened in Placer Rica Canyon multiple times since I have been a docent. Right, and then gradually it recovers. Right, and that is the typical pattern. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes something else happens, and usually that's because there's a press disturbance instead of a pulse disturbance. Pulse is one-time event. Fire comes, burns, then in the lifetime of those plants, there's not another fire. Right? That is the way it would be if people weren't starting fires accidentally or on purpose. Right? A press disturbance is a change in the system, right? Where there's like now you have perhaps gone to an ecosystem where there's a fire every few years on the side of the freeway, right? Or there's a fire every 10 years, right? Or here in the park. So then that's not just one pulse, but a lot of pulses of the same thing. And the ability of the system to recover changes. So we call this recovery, complete recovery, succession. Right, and then this is not succession or lack of recovery. Yes?
Janet, I was thinking more of the press disturbance as somebody going through with Roundup that kills everything and it's really dead. They use the kind that suppresses the seed production. Whereas in the pulse disturbance, repeated pulse disturbance, where you see it go from it comes down and then it gradually goes up. At first it's pretty steep and then it comes back up. Repeated pulse disturbance, the way I've understood it, is it comes all the way down to here, and as it starts up, fairly steep, if there's another fire, it goes down, and the recovery is just
Yep.
much,
Yes, this is a
Slower.
simplified version,
okay.
right, of does recover, does not recover. And at some point, right, even if it completely recovers, if this happens, if there's, enough of a disturbance, or a disturbance that doesn't let up, right? Like, so, where the ecosystem changes. Like, we thought we were having, before this winter, this glorious rain, we thought, okay, things are different now. We are just a drier place. And now we have, fewer of some kinds of plants and more of some kinds of animals, right? Because we are a drier place, right? But now we have rain and it's wonderful. But, so it can also be, a press disturbance can also be a change that doesn't let up, right? So it can be repeated pulses, or it can be something that changes in the rest of the system that doesn't go away, doesn't leave off. There's an example from oak woodlands in Portugal. Remember back to the beginning that we have a Mediterranean climate like that in Portugal, right? And other parts of the world that are on the trailing western edge of continents. Right? So they also have oak trees, oak woodlands in Portugal, and they have weather like ours where it rains in a short part of the year and then is dry, entirely dry the whole rest of the year, and it's relatively mild temperature all the time, just like we have. So in this oak woodland in Portugal, they also have fires, and we're looking at the recovery of the oak woodlands from fires. And they found that when, this is looking at the proportion of seeds remaining on the ground, so this acorns, right, oak tree seeds, remaining in the ground over time. So the seeds are what let the system recover, right? The seeds sprout back and it recovers, right? Get the plants coming back. So in this example, that the number of seeds left determines whether it recovers or not, right? And if there's a fire and some of the seeds sprout, and there's not time for more seeds to develop on the plants and fall back onto the ground before the next fire, then it won't recover, right? So if there's not a chance to build up the seed bank, right, in the soil, then you don't have that resilience, that ability to recover, right? So if fires come very close together, the system has a much harder time recovering. So this is true of any kind of disturbance, right? Like if you were going to drive a truck through an area, right, and it knocks down the plants, and then they're going to re-sprout from the seeds. Right? If you do that over and over again, eventually they won't re-sprout. So this balance, right, of resilience, like we, or at least I, growing up in, my lifetime, and most of yours, maybe not all of you, right, there was this assumption that nature always puts itself back, right? Nature will always recover, right? Because we hadn't really done big enough disturbances that we remember, right? There weren't enough pulses of human effort in places, right? That we didn't know about places in the ancient world where human activity had actually changed the ecosystem. Right now we know there are examples all over the world of places where, like Easter Island or Cahokia in the Midwest, where human activity changed the place, right? Changed the ecosystem that was there. So there's a shift, right, from this assumption that nature always recovers back to where it was before, right, which is this, right, to change your thinking from this to the possibility of this, right, that it's possible it won't recover. And we don't know exactly where those points are, but we know that the more times something is disturbed, the more likely it is not to recover. Okay, so that's resilience. Now this is a picture of Placerita Canyon after a fire. And this is a picture not of Placerita Canyon, of another place after a series of fires over a long time. And you see that there's a patchwork here of different stages of recovery, right, over this valley, right? That there are some places where the trees are green and have grown back, and some places where it hasn't quite grown back, and other places where the trees are still dead for the time being. So fires make a mosaic of burned and unburned patches, and patches in different stages of recovery, right? If they burn a very big area, once in a while. What we know from here in the park, because we've seen it burn several times and recover, is that in most cases you can't tell that an area in the park has burned other than the char on the outside of the oak trees after about 7 years. So we are resilient to fire here, which is a wonderful thing.
As you walk along the trail going up to the water tower, as you look out at the opposite hillsides, I think you can see areas where fire has burned enough times that it's just beaten down. You know, it's not chaparral, it's not oak wood, it's not. It's just whatever brush has managed to come up since the last fires. I think you can really see it if you look.
So another thing that does happen after fire and after repeated fires especially is that the grass changes. So instead of having the native grass, you have this non-native grass, and that covers the ground and it changes what can come back. Yeah, so definitely alongside the freeways, there are multiple things that cause this, especially along roads. One is that there are so many fires along the side of the freeway from the cars for various reasons. Because even, in the summertime, just a car pulling off the side of the road, just because it's so hot underneath, can start the grass on fire. And even without anyone dropping a cigarette or making a spark or anything. So there's the fires are frequent, and that the side of the road is disturbed a lot in making the roads and keeping the roads clear and keeping the brush from encroaching on the road, and that the system of managing the roadsides to keep them from eroding, sometimes spraying on grass seed and non-native grasses. So then it gives the non-native grass a big boost over the native grass. So there are definitely places like that you can see around here that are no longer recovering back to the native system. All right, and another transition to another idea. Yes.
I was just saying, the grazing also has been very important in changing the landscape. You see some hills that are totally smooth, there are no more bushes, and and you can see where the cow were walking, you can see all the little level where they kept on making little paths, and those do not recover as being chaparral at all. I mean, it's just smooth, and sometimes it's very pretty in the spring when it's covered with grass, but it's nothing else.
Yes, it's because there's this constant cropping of the plants there. So even if a seed gets in there from the chaparral, it doesn't get a chance to grow. Yeah, that's absolutely true. They don't have the seeds. There are also some people have found that some grazing, a little grazing, helps a more desert environment to sustain more plants. because of the way the cattle dig up the ground and make these little pockets where some water can stay and some plants can grow a little longer. But that's like a low level of grazing, like would be similar to having wild herds of like bison, right, that we don't have anymore. So low level grazing can be good for a system, so to keep the balance, right? It's all about balance. Okay, so now the next transition I want to get to is putting ourselves into the picture, right? So, right, what is the most common animal by biomass in Platte Canyon? Mountain lions, so not too many, they pass through. Birds, one species. Just like, so not all the insects or all the mammals, but just one species. Mule deer, maybe. What is, but you're missing one.
People.
People! It is absolutely people, right? Like look around when you're out there, right? Like what is the big animal you can't get away from out there, right? People. Now, we're not living here all the time, right? But neither is the mountain lion, right? Or the hawk living, necessarily in the canyon all the time, right? But we're coming here and doing things, walking around, putting up signs, right? And so people, right? So if there was any other kind of animal that was as big as us and as common as us here, we would be afraid to come here, right? Even if they were deer, right? Like we wouldn't like it, right? What would it feel like? If there were deer, if there were like, if 14,000 deer came through our school program every year. Okay. Right? It's right. We kind of we don't have ourselves in perspective, right? So
They think that about us.
they think that they I guess they do, right? Right. So yeah, think about that, right? We were, on Tuesday there was like a herd of us big humans out there listening to Helen walking around, and several herds of small humans passing by that we had to squeeze over to make room for, right? We are having a big effect. So let's keep that in perspective. So this graph, which I like to use because it looks like there is nothing on this graph. There's just this little bit of red stuff along the bottom and up that side, like decoration, right? But this is the population of humans on Earth over time. Right, so it has this break here, right? So this goes back to, 2 to 5 million years ago, and then there's this break, and then everything from here is like from 8,000 years ago on. Okay, so these are billions, right? So here's 1 billion humans, right? So there was not a billion humans till the 20th century.
Wow.
Okay, and then here's where we are now, right? Like up here, like just over 7.5 or 7.75. About here. All right, so this is a population explosion of a big animal. There's no way this doesn't have an effect on the ecosystems of the planet. It's just not possible, right? And you see, there are plagues of humans knock back the human population. So this little dent here, you can see it goes down a little bit here, that was the Black Death plague. Right? Killed a large percentage of the humans who were alive then, right? But there weren't very many altogether. So we have changed the world, and we have a new geological epoch, right, declared by the Union of Geoscientists who define, right, the geological periods over time, you know, like we all know, right, Jurassic, right, because that's when the dinosaurs were, and, right, but all these times over the history of the Earth, we have a new one now, because the Earth has changed enough that the systems on the Earth work a little differently. One,
Sorry, I'm just trying to figure out the 400.
oh, deciding this is an argument that is currently active is when did this happen? And that's because all the other geological transitions happen over like tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And this one is way faster. So they can't decide whether it was at the beginning of urbanization or the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right? Or if that is all just the same thing in geological time. That's what that is, yeah. So it's hard to say exactly when this started, but we know it's different.
So are you saying urbanization began around the year 1100?
In some places, not modern urbanization, but there were cities.
Certainly,
Right.
so.
So, yeah, and agriculture is not, the beginning of agriculture is not seen as a place where the whole ecosystem of the world changed, right? Because that was earlier than that. So it's either when humans became very concentrated in cities or when humans started making a lot of different synthetic chemicals that were never made before. So, changes in geological and chemical patterns worldwide. One of them is that there's a little bit of plastic everywhere now. A little bit of everywhere that anyone has looked, all over the planet, there's some plastic. There's some little fibers of plastic in water samples everywhere anyone that has looked, or in the sand and in the bottom of ocean basins, right? There's just a little traces of non-biodegradable human stuff everywhere. And there are some changes in other geochemical cycles, right? The one that I'll talk about more that, well, you tell me, what is the one that we talk about the most, like change in geological cycle due to human activity? Climate, right? Changing the climate. So, but we'll get to that in a little bit.
It makes me think of the press disturbance versus pulse. Volcanoes would be like a pulse
Right.
disturbance, like Krakatoa, and we're a press
Yes.
disturbance.
Yes.
Ever think of
Right.
it that way?
That is one way to think about it. Yes. On the global scale, right? Or like, you know, the big meteors, right, that caused a change in the climate, right? It happened once, but right, and then things recovered. But we'll see what happens. We're not done yet. So, you know, on the geological scale, right, humans have been having a big effect for a short time. So if we were to like scale out and look at it on the scale of, you know, millions or billions of years, maybe this is also a pulse. Anyhow, so here are some ways of turning around the human population to effect on the planet. If we think of the activity of the average human, that the Earth now withstands at least 100,000 times the impact of humans that it did in 5,000 BCE, before the current era, or just, you know, BC, as we used to say. And that's just based on strictly the numbers of humans and not what the humans are doing. So that's not even getting into like the fact that each one of us has, being, you know, us in this room, has more impact on the planet than the average person on the planet does, right? That we have above average influence on the system. Get more on that later too. But that, you know, that feels good and bad, right? But it's true.
Yeah.
So this is just based on the numbers, right? That there are at least 100,000 times more people. And if you change that into like human impact per time, right, we have the same impact in 5 minutes that our ancestors at this time had in a year. Right? Yes. So, you know, it's just really playing with the numbers to put it in perspective, like just flipping around like number of people per time. And anyhow, really this is something to think about, right? That we are exerting a lot of leverage right now on what happens in the ecosystem. And one way to evaluate your own personal effect is to run something like this thing you get, the quiz you get here, is to calculate your ecological footprint. Right? This is about how much impact you personally have. It's a measure of how much of the surface of the earth is needed to support a particular way of life. Right? And this is your homework. I'm glad to see people writing this down, because your homework is to do this, is to go to myfootprint.org and calculate your ecological footprint. How much of the earth is needed to support you. Now there are some things that we have a lot of choice about, right? Like, you know, how big our house is, how, you know, much shopping we do, what kinds of things we buy, what kinds of travel we do, whether we fly to Paris for the weekend and fly back every weekend. Or, right, exactly. It feels nice, right? Like you know, but you have choices about things, right? And you only see this side of it, and you don't see the other part, which is like what went into making that possible, which is, you know, takes you back to this cereal bowl of Ecology I, right? Which is how are you connected to things, right? How is your traveling, commuting from Alaska to your job in LA every day by private jet, what is that connected to, right? All the extraction of fuel, all the production of planes, you know, there's a lot of things in there, right? And a lot of people you are connected to through your activity. And there are some things that we have less, you know, influence about. Like the first question in this quiz is where do you live? Where do you live, right? And there are some things that we as a country do, right? We have a big military that we support with our activity, right? And other countries, like say Nepal, they do not have a big military that they support with activity, right? So there are some things that you don't have a choice about on a day-to-day basis, right, that go into this calculation, but you maybe have a choice on the longer term. So your ecological footprint says how much of the surface of the earth is devoted to supplying your needs, right, your activities. If you think about, you know, I'm thinking like that I used a lot of water to make this cotton that I'm wearing, right? Right, I used some petrochemicals to make this nylon vest. Right, I got some coffee that got shipped from somewhere in the tropics because that's where coffee grows. Right, so every little thing connects you to the rest of the world. Another thing that ecological footprint calculator does, which is kind of perspective shifting, is that it tells you if everybody in the world lived like you, how many Earths would it take? Okay, and like, you know, we're pretty fortunate. We have, you know, a pretty big influence on the world, all of us, compared to people who live in some other parts of the world, right? That we have, you know, more than the average impact. And you will be surprised, I guarantee. And the biggest, have my students at CSUN also do this, to, see where they are in the world relative to consumption of everything. And the highest number I've ever seen is that if everyone lived like them, they would need 9 Earths. Okay. And the lowest number I've ever managed myself is somewhat less than like 1.47, like a little less than 1.5 Earths. And which I blow every now and then by flying to another continent. And we only have one. Yeah, it's good to get in perspective with the rest of the world. So here's another way of putting that in perspective, which also comes from this global footprint network. This is like if you look at the resources of the whole of the Earth that are available in any one year for human activity, if everybody lived like the average person in each of these different countries, then when would we run out of resources for that year? Okay, so it's another way of flipping the ratio. So, right, so we started in January, right, and everyone lived like people in Luxembourg, right, which luckily very few people live in Luxembourg, because if everyone on the planet, all those 7.5 billion people, lived like they were in Luxembourg, we would run out of resources by February 17th for each year. Right? That's impossible. So here we are, the US, 14 March, that's next week. Okay. And a lot of us feel like this year has just started. Right? So, right, we are not on average the most, resource intensive people on the planet, but we're close, right? And if everybody lived, like people in Honduras, right, you would get through the average person in Honduras, you would get through the whole year with the resources on Earth. But a lot of people don't want to live in Honduras, right? So we've got to come up with some different ways of having a good quality of life, right? With technology that it uses that's more efficient for resource use, right? And then you can have good quality of life and use your resources longer, right? So if you look at some of the other places on here, right? So here's France, right? That is like twice as long on average that the resources would last if we all lived like we were in France, where the food is very good. Right? And it's not like, an impoverished way of living in Switzerland or Japan, right? So it's just more efficient in resource use. So it's something to think about human activity, or when you get the question, how many people can the Earth support? And, are there too many people? How many people can the Earth support? And the answer is it depends on what people you're talking about. Depends on what those people are choosing to do. Right? Like, the Earth can support the people that it has on it now, right? But it's not, the resources are not very evenly spread. But because I only say that because we are here, right? It's obviously supporting these people right now, right? Whether that can go on indefinitely, it's a different question. But it's important to think about a person is not, person's impact is not the same, right, across all places and all choices that humans can make. That there are options, and that you have a lot of leverage if you have a lot of impact. Right? If you do the ecological footprint calculator and you have a huge ecological footprint, right? At first you're like, bummer, a huge ecological footprint. But then the upside of that is that means you have a lot of leverage to change things. So keep that in mind, right? That you have a lot of options. All right, so the next, so what we talked about, and something that comes up in ecological footprint calculation, and it comes up in the Anthropocene, the definition of the Anthropocene, right? This new geological era that we are in, is the change in the atmospheric carbon concentration, so CO2 and methane primarily. Also water vapor affects the warming of the planet and the changing of weather patterns. Okay, so we used to have a different, I was looking for, somebody made a very nice graph like this that had this lowered one on it, and it didn't go out so far, from one of the intergovernmental panels on climate change. But it only went up to 2010. But I was looking for a more recent one, but the more recent ones are very much more complicated because they have a lot of predictions about if we did this and we did that. So I went back to this little bit older one, but it doesn't go quite up to the present. But the pattern continues, right? So these are two different measurements, two different places on Earth, one in New Zealand and one in Hawaii, right, that have been recording the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere for a long time. No question. The CO2 concentration in the atmosphere is increasing, right? And in fact, it's accelerating. It's increasing faster all the time. Okay. Just absolutely not up for discussion that there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. Also not up for discussion because it's recorded over a long period of time. So this is a temperature, that the average temperature on Earth is increasing. No discussion. All right, here's from 1850 to 2010, 2012. That, the temperature is increasing. And some people would say, well, it varies all the time, varies from year to year. So a quick answer to that is to do decadal averages, so the average temperature over 10 years. Right? So for this same data, but now it's averaged for every 10 years. Right? And the next one is up here. Right? Still, really, there's no discussion. Okay, and then if you look at that data spread over the whole planet, where, with this kind of trend, whether it's warmer by a few degrees Celsius, so you approximately double that to get degrees Fahrenheit. It's a little bit, it's like 1.9 instead of 2, but, so 5 degrees warmer Fahrenheit, or 1.5 degrees cooler Fahrenheit. There are some places on Earth that are actually getting a little cooler, right? And you might hear that argument. Well, some places are warming up, other places are cooling. And that is true, technically, right? But the places that are cooling are small, right? This little blob here in the North Atlantic is actually cooler because the circulation that comes around the North Atlantic, right? This is the Gulf Stream that comes up here. It brings warm water up and makes Northern Europe warmer than it would be otherwise. That circulation is slowing down. Less warm water coming up here, it's actually getting cooler up there. So some parts of the world are predicted to get cooler, like Scotland and Iceland, and maybe Scandinavia, depending on what happens with the flow of water here out of the Arctic. Okay, but everywhere else it's getting warmer. Yeah.
Do you know if the reason why it's slowing down is because the ice is melting?
That's what I was talking about up here. That we don't
what's
know
causing
exactly what's happening up there, but it is definitely melting. Now this slowing down is because there's a lower temperature gradient. So what makes the water move from one place to another is a gradient of temperature. Just like it makes the air masses move around. So It's just less circulation around that gyre around the North Atlantic. But definitely locally up here, there are some things going on that are very complicated. Because the water up there is more, because of the melting, there's more fresh water. And that kind of stays on the surface and it changes things. Anyhow, it's warmer.
Yeah.
Okay? Scientifically, there is no debate, none. There is no sides of this. That is a totally political story, economically motivated, that there is any debate about why this is. Right? That this is human activity that makes this warmer. The insulating effect of CO2 on the atmosphere is well known, well described, that we have no problem with saying that the planet Venus is much, much warmer than the planet Mercury, even though it's closer to the sun, right, and much warmer than the Earth because it has a thick CO2 atmosphere. Right, that the atmosphere has lots and lots of CO2 and it's very insulating. And the surface of Venus, like you don't see pictures of it very much, like think of the whole space program, like there've been a couple of probes that went to Venus and they melt. Right? You get some pictures on falling through, but then they melt because it's so hot there. And no one is claiming that that's not true. Right? So we know that CO2 and methane insulate the atmosphere. And we know that when you burn things, you get CO2. Right? When you burn things, or when you digest things, right? You eat your food and break it down, you get CO2. You breathe it out. Right? And we know, right, if you burn something, you measure what comes out of that, it's CO2. Right? So we know, and we know, approximately how much fuel has been burned over different lengths of time. So that's not a scientific discussion. Okay, it's a discussion that is important to people for economic reasons, which I'm not totally blowing off because, we all participate in this economy. But scientifically, it's not a discussion. We know why it's warmer. And we know that there are lots of sources of CO2 into the atmosphere, right? So CO2 in the atmosphere, right? That, yes, everything that does respiration, right, releases CO2, right? We release CO2 when we breathe out, so do all the other animals. So, plants take up CO2 when they're doing photosynthesis, and then at nighttime they can give off some CO2, right, on balance. But plants, if they're making more plant material, they are net taking up CO2 over time because the plant is made out of carbon, right, which is put together with the energy of sunlight from CO2, from carbon dioxide, right? So wood is made of carbon dioxide put together with the energy of sunlight. Okay. So yes, there are all these things happening, right? There's not a huge increase in net number of animals. There are some increases in bacteria and other soil organisms that are melting, that are doing more activity than they were before, possibly adding more CO2 to the atmosphere. Fires add CO2 quickly, right, rather than decomposition. If something burns, then the CO2 is released quickly. And there are some processes that slowly put CO2 back into the ground, into rocks. But the big change in this balance that has been this. I don't take too much time on this because it's not a discussion. But this is a nice graphic put together to show the relative effects of different sources of warming on the planet, right? So the effects in energy units, so how much energy to the warming of the planet is added by different processes. And all of these things, right, like clouds and reflectiveness and changes in, the solar irradiance, like you might have heard that, the planet just seems warmer because there's a change in the brightness of the sun at different times, right? All of these things can potentially affect the heat staying within the atmosphere of the Earth, right? CO2 is a big one, right? And changes in solar irradiance is a small one. Okay. Changes in methane. Methane is very effective greenhouse gas, insulates a lot. Changes in methane, pretty significant. Considering methane is a very small part of the atmosphere, right? So it's easy to get a big percentage change from something like methane. Right? Dust can work in multiple ways. If it's more dusty, you can have less sun getting to the surface of the Earth, but you can also have, depends on the dust, honestly, because you see here, there's like different kinds of dust. What the chemical composition of the dust is matters. Clouds cool the Earth in general, so if there are more clouds, there's more cooling, right? Water vapor. And then this is the effect of, this is nice to just see these things all on one graphic, right? So this is things that anthropogenic, it's like Anthropocene, right? It's things that humans did, so human activities. And this is the relative force and radiative forcing, so how much heat is attributable to human activity 1950, 1980, and 2011. But see, this has a big, these do have big error bars, right? Big estimate, but clearly increasing. And, the exact amount, the exact numbers are kind of messy. Okay, so this is a prediction that was made, 10 years ago from an EPA report on ecological and hydrological significance of ephemeral and intermittent streams in arid and semi-arid American Southwest. Okay, what that means is here, right? And right, so streams. They were looking at what does climate change mean for places like Placerita Canyon, for intermittent streams in the Southwest. Okay, so that's okay. They predicted these things 10 years ago, right? Warming, drying. Intensification of droughts, increased variability in precipitation, longer, hotter growing seasons, shift in vegetation, greater droughts, floods in some regions, less floods and droughts in other regions, mostly variation, and all of that accelerating. How good was that prediction? Very close. Very close, right? Like this is what we talk about, right? We say, I can't believe it hasn't rained for 2 years, and I can't believe it's raining so much today, and there are flash flood warnings and droughts at the same time, right? So this is a pretty good prediction. So it also tells you that these climate models seem to be predicting what we are experiencing, right? So it increases our confidence in what they can tell you. Okay. All right. So I want to come back after this dive into the bummer, right? That things are changing. We're changing it on a global scale. We are responsible for it. We have all this leverage. Like it becomes like so heavy, and that is not where we want to go. We want to be like, okay, we have all this leverage. What can we do? Right? you know, to make the paradise on earth that we want. Right? Right? What can we do to make it the way we want? So Rachel Carson, who knows Rachel Carson? No. Rachel Carson was a biologist and writer who wrote mostly in the 1950s and 60s. She was famous for writing stories about nature, and she worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for most of her career. And she wrote magazine articles, and then they got compiled into books that were bestsellers about observing nature, and specifically about marine biology. And you can look her up. And then she wrote a book called Silent Spring, which is about DDT, the effects of DDT on birds, where she brought together all the scientific research and synthesized it into a book, which was a national bestseller, right? Which is an incredible feat in my mind, to take all this chemical information and distill it down, you know. And the title, Silent Spring, was like, what if we accidentally killed all the birds and we didn't have birdsong in the spring? Right? And we have less birdsong in the spring than we used to already. Okay, but so her work and the response to her work by the public led to the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S. and the whole policy field of environmental protection. Just pretty cool, right? So this is what, when she was asked later in her life what she would, if she could give something to everybody, you know, to people in the world, and she said she would give them a sense of wonder so indestructible that it would last throughout life, an unfailing antidote against the boredom and disenchantments of later years, the sterile preoccupation with things that are artificial, the alienation from the source of our strength. All right, that's what she wished for people. And that's kind of, I feel like that's kind of what we do here, right? Is that we are handing out awe and understanding and pointing to things, that's amazing. Like, look at that tree, look at that gopher hole, look at that snake, right? Look at this world we live in and these things we have here, and how you can feel that strength rising in yourself when you even pay attention to it, right? Or you can then pay attention to yourself and say, look at this animal. Like, look at how it works. Look at how it grows from like one cell up to this big, right? And you see that you are part of nature and you are amazing, and that all of these things here in the park that fit together in a system are each individually and together awesome, right? And this is what part of what we're communicating in our programs, right? Is that, you know, this is what something we have to offer that will help the whole world. So this statement is from a book by Rachel Carson called The Sense of Wonder, which was really just a magazine article about parenting. She was not a parent, but she raised her nephew, which has been put together in this form with a lot of pictures, which lives over here on the bookcase if you ever want to read the whole essay about that. And then I have been looking for years for, right, the next Rachel Carson. What is the next, like an inspirational author that helps us communicate these things? And there is very recently this book called The Lost Words. Anyone heard of this book before? Lost Words? Okay, this is a stunningly gorgeous picture book. It has, for each thing it has a kind of mystery page, but it has some letters and you can figure out what they're about, right? Followed by a poem and a picture of what it's about, and then that thing in context. Right? So it's horse chestnuts or conkers, which are not a local thing here, but common in the UK. So here's dandelion, right? Dandelion. And there's dandelions in the context of their ecosystem, the organism, the ecosystem. And then you'll say, why is it called lost words then? Why isn't it called beautiful things in nature? Or things we see in the backyard? And it's called Lost Words. This book was inspired by, move ahead to a page from the book. Oops. This book was inspired by an observation of the Oxford Junior Dictionary. And what was the Oxford, like all dictionaries, the Oxford Junior Dictionary, Children's Dictionary, is regularly updated, right, to add words that are now in usage and take out words that are not used much anymore. And the observation was that a bunch of words were removed from the Oxford Junior Dictionary, and they included acorn, adder, lark, ivy, kingfisher, right? Lots and lots of organisms that are common in the UK. And they were replaced mostly, like the new updated words were mostly things to do with technology, like attachment, blog, broadband, bullet point, cut and paste, voicemail, right? Which sounds silly, but it says something about us culturally, right? That these things are no longer in the everyday experience of children, right? These things like acorns and ravens and willows, right? Which are all words that were removed from this dictionary. And so this book, this art project, was a response to that and the lost words. And this is happening not just in England, right, where this publication is from, but here too, right, where the experience of children is getting thinner and different, right, and of adults, right, that people's experience of nature is getting thinner. And actually someone wrote an article about it, called it the Great Thinning, that we just have less. We have less biodiversity, we have less numbers of most species, and even culturally thinner, that we have less different languages on Earth and less different cultures on Earth. Great thinning. So this is a fight back against the great thinning, okay? And I highly recommend it. I recommend you look at it. This is the acorn picture, and each poem, they say, is a spell to bring back this thing into, like, to draw it back into culture, right? So before we take our break, let's do the spell for acorn, okay? Right? Here it is together. Come on. As flake is to blizzard, as curve is to spear, as knot is to net, as one is to many, as coin is to money, as bird is to flock, as rock is to mountain, as drop is to fountain, as spring is to river, as glint is to glitter, as near is to far, as wind is to weather, as feather is to flight, as light is to star, as kindness is to good, so acorn is to wood. Wow. Isn't that really beautiful? And the pictures are so beautiful. And
Who's the author?
the author is Robert McFarlane, and Jackie Morris is the illustrator. And it's kind of started a kind of lost words kind of movement. If you start to look around, there are albums of folk songs devoted to the lost words, and there are fundraisers to get the books in schools and to get the book in prisons and tenement buildings and just all kinds of things. To get people to pay attention. Look at this.
She must have got permission from us to do it.
Oh, right. Have a deeper experience.
As barn is to owl.
Anyhow, there is this, the John Muir Trust Initiatives, The Lost Word is an explorer's guide to the lost word if you wanted to look up, has some activities and writing prompts and all kinds of things.
Nature
That
Tots, that
link
would be
this
good.
book in. Next year, we had not much rain and very little stream. And then the subsequent 6 years, we've had like no stream. So then I took out the part about the stream, but this year, we have a stream. So we are gonna have tadpoles and we're gonna have all kinds of stuff, water bugs. I have high hopes that this year's rain will supply the stream with water, well into May.
4th of July, I'm
4th of
predicting.
July? 4th of July.
I'm predicting 4th of July.
All right, 4th of July.
We should make bets.
Could make bets. So, you want to know a little bit about this stream because this stream is the focal point of Placerita Canyon, right? It is what formed Placerita Canyon geologically. It is the park is organized along the stream, right? When visitors come here, they want to walk along the stream. They want to play in the stream, right? So, what kind of stream is this? Who said it? Intermittent. This is an intermittent stream, meaning it runs part of the year and not all year. All right, so it's not a perennial stream, and it's not like an ephemeral stream. It's more like washes in the desert that just have water immediately after rain. So we have an intermittent stream. And our intermittent stream is full of beautiful aquatic insects normally when it's running. And our stream does not usually have fish in it because our stream is up here, first order stream, which is fishless, right? So the streams are described by people who study watersheds and streams according to how far they are from the fish. And right up at where there are little drainages, there are small intermittent streams that have microinvertebrates in them, and a lot of which you can't see, and a lot of plant matter falls in there and it gets eaten by small animals that can tolerate drying up, right? And that breaking down of plant matter and turning it into the bodies of little animals, right, is part of the food web of the stream, and they flow downstream with the water, and they are food for things that live further downstream. Right, so something to think about here is that everything is flowing down to the ocean, right, from the mountains to the ocean. Right, partly the water is flowing through the ground and partly over the surface, right, but there are a lot of little creatures in here that spend part of their life in the stream and part of their life on the land or in the air. So you'll see, you can see some of those larval and adult forms depicted giant size in the museum, which we should really call the interpretive center, but it's a lot of yes. In the interpretive center, in the riparian woodland display. Right, the aquatic insects were made gigantic to make them interesting and big. They are not actual size, and do not expect to see, a dragonfly larva this big anywhere. right? Or a water beetle the size of your fist, right? Well, hopefully we'll see them in person this year. We also have this nice book on aquatic insects, which is a, heavy-duty technical book, right? But if you're interested in the aquatic insects, it's worth delving in here. Here is a giant water bug, such as is depicted in the interpretive center. Okay, and this lives on that shelf right there. Okay, I'm gonna put it here. Okay, so everything is flowing downstream. It feeds the things in the next level of stream, right? And gets down to the ocean, and everything flows downstream. So keep that in mind when you're, picking up your plastic on your, if you're walking around with kids and you're picking up some trash. This is an actual picture of Long Beach Harbor after rain. I guarantee this year, because there hasn't been much rain, there is so much stuff going to the beach and the harbors, both dissolved things and big physical things, because it's been accumulating here on the land and in the stream beds. And it's another connection, right? This idea of connection, right? What's connected to what? Everything is connected. That, a piece of trash that ends up here on the ground, right, can wash into Pasarita Creek, which is running like crazy today. So run down, right, to the Santa Clara River, run down to Ventura, and out into the Pacific and become part of the Pacific garbage patch, or part of the plastic on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, right? So it's all connected, right? The water is connected, the little, insect larvae that can feed the sticklebacks further down the river is connected, and also whatever other stuff goes in there. So keep that in continuity in mind. So this is jumping back to the insects. Something that is a theme in our intermittent stream is change and metamorphosis. Most of the things that spend some of their lifetime in the stream have to do something else during the dry season, right? Because our stream, this intermittent stream, is not there all the time. So when the stream is not there, they're living in the air, on the land, under the ground, right? So this is a picture of a beautiful metamorphosis that we associate with being a terrible thing, but look at how gorgeous that is when that happens, right? Mosquitoes lay their eggs in water, right? And we might have mosquitoes in water around the park. Probably not as much in the stream, maybe in little side pools of the stream, and not in the pond because, well, the mosquitoes lay their eggs there, but the fish eat them. So this is a mosquito larva, and just like a caterpillar into a butterfly, mosquito larva turns into a flying mosquito by hatching out of its cocoon, which is called a pupa, at the surface of the water, without getting wet. Right? It's just amazing. And this, if you're interested in things that live in freshwater, this lifeinfreshwater.net has just gorgeous, gorgeous pictures of aquatic insects and other things. So, right, that's a metamorphosis. Frogs, right, that start as tadpoles, turn into frogs, right, another metamorphosis. So it's a good opportunity, the stream, right, being intermittent, to think about that kind of change and repeated change. Right? And kids love the tadpoles. Like, we've had tadpoles in the pond, tadpoles of toads mostly, And we have some places, we had some tadpoles and frogs in the pools on the creek in the last few years, but not very many. So this year, high hopes. Certainly in my neighborhood, I hear them at night. So I think they're here too. Also in this picture of the tadpoles, we see this green fluff, right? And sometimes people say, oh, it's gross, it's dirty, it shouldn't be there, right? Like, what is that? Ew. Right? And this is algae, right? It's a kind of algae that is little branchy filaments. When I was a kid, we called it green mermaid hair, and I never thought it was a problem. But you will see this showing up in the pond, and you'll see lots of it showing up in the stream, and it can be indicative of there being a lot of nutrients in the water. So because it's a plant, it does photosynthesis, it uses light, right? It takes up nutrients from the water. So if you have water that has a lot of nutrients in it, right, like if there are a lot of animals living in it, it might turn green because there are a lot of ammonia and nitrate from the excrement of the animals, right, that feeds the algae. So it can have too much of a good thing, and that is called eutrophication, right, which is like true, literally means true feeding, right? Remember, like trophic pyramids, that refers to feeding. And U is true feeding. So eutrophication is when there are too much nutrients and it changes the system to be dominated by algae. And if the stream gets really full of algae, then there's not enough room for other things to live there, and it shades them. And also at night, the oxygen concentration in the water can go down, and then in the daytime, the oxygen concentration goes way up because of the biological activity of the algae. And then if you get to the end of the season and a lot of algae dies, then that decomposition can take up a lot of oxygen. So it can just cause a lot of chemical disruption of the stream. But it's not that the algae itself is bad, it's just that it's responding to a high concentration of nutrients. And this year I would expect to see a lot of nutrients in the stream because there hasn't been a lot of rain, and people put fertilizer on their lawns, and then, right, the fertilizer drains off excess fertilizer that's not taken up by their plants, can drain off into the streams. So sometimes you see later in the season a lot of this green stuff, and people will ask you about it. What is that? Is it bad? Right? It's not bad, but there can be too much of it. Right? It's algae. It's part of the normal system, right? And the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project was looking at comparing a lot of different streams in the San Gabriel Mountains and looking at what diversity of algae is in them and how that affects the health of the whole system. And they really found that the more diversity you had of microscopic things and little plants and animals and algae, the more the system was able to tolerate disturbances. So that's good, right? So you want to have a variety of things in your stream. And I like this picture because you see this all the time out there. Like you'll see a patch of just green, slimy stuff, and you know, you might feel like, you know, that does look good. Right? But if you look at it under the microscope, you see this. Pretty. Right? And I brought some pond water here to look at for time. And then if you magnify this further, you can see it has, you know, beautiful little delicate structures inside. And I absolutely invite you to look for videos of pond water and stream water and little creatures, but I'm gonna take time to show you a lot of that stuff today. But this is a good place to look for resources about streams. Okay, and then a picture of the stream, of our stream with some tadpoles. And I want to jump over to talking about this box. This is, I'm going to turn off this now.
Yeah, that
This one? Push it twice? Yes. Oh, I mean blocking. Okay.
you got it.
Let me down. Okay. So, you know the boxes, the box program, the Discovery Box program run by Andrea. Andrea just said, yes, I know that program. Okay? This is the pond and stream box, which I made just before the last 5 years of drought. And we have not had this box and a stream at the same time. But I want to give you a little tour of what's in it and what you can do with it. We used to bring it at an open house out by the pond, but it was designed to be by the stream when there's a stream. Okay, so this is a nice book about ponds. Right, one small square has it's a series. Right, it has pictures of what you might find in a pond. It's kind of information and image dense things, and kneelers to kneel next to the pond and look in it for a long time comfortably. All right, you have a long magnifying glass that you can look into the pond with. It has a little flashlight here. It's a little bit fussy, so it's not good for really small kids, but a little bit older is good. For really small kids, we have these metamorphosis models. So there are 2 sets each of frogs and mosquitoes, and the top of this is a good place to play with them because it has some parts that are blue like water and some parts that are sandpaper like the land. So you can arrange the models with what stages are in the water and what stages are on the land. It has dishes, which are good for putting things in, like things that I have here. And I gathered up a little bucket of pond on my way in. And in here are a lot of little tiny snails and bigger snails, and a lot of this algae, which looks really great when you magnify it. And there are 2 different kinds of snails, the olive-shaped ones and the ram's horn ones. And a lot of broken down plant stuff that kids imagine is monstrous stuff until they look at it and go, oh, it's a root, it's a plant piece. But nice to look at. And some partially decayed leaves that you can see the lacy veins in. So there are always some dishes to look at things under the microscope, and the park has several microscopes that have to be plugged in, which makes it difficult to use them outside. But when you're inside, or if you can set up somewhere where there's an extension cord, you can use these. But we borrow some sometimes from a school that don't need to be plugged in. Paper towels because it's wet. This is a little small guide to things you can find in ponds and streams. For example, here is a snail, like the snails that are most common in the pond. And it identifies it on the back as a pond snail and gives some more information about it. So if someone finds something that, like we normally have these beetles that are water boatman beetles, that kind of whirligig around in the water, right? So this has some more information on the back. A kid can find it, or a family, and you helping out find the organism and get some more information about it. And it also has, for some, the larval and adult forms of things that are in the water. Okay. And then we have also in this box some things that have to do with the non-living parts of the stream. Like, pass this to you. What does that have to do with the stream?
It's like the geology, different rocks and sand.
Yeah, it's different rocks and sands and
Layers.
organic stuff, and immediately you want to do that, right?
Yeah.
Shake it, shake it. Cool. Now what do you know? Now what do you know about the stream once you shake this thing?
The water goes to the top.
Water goes, the stuff settles out, right? And
mixes up.
it mixes up when the water's moving fast, like when you're shaking it, and when the water slows down,
Settles.
it settles. And
And there's little like
little spaces,
pathways, yeah.
right? So there's spaces for things to live in there. And the big things settle out first, and the smaller things settle out later. And that's why if you dig into the bank of the stream, you see layers. And the organic things get concentrated in layers. Okay. There are also there are microscope slides and bottles, right? This says pond water, and this says creek water, and this says tap water. And if you collect one of each of these things and use these drinking water test strips, you can find out that they're chemically different from each other, that the pond has a lot more ammonia, the tap water has chlorine, right? So you can, these have multiple different things they measure, and you can see the pH is usually a little different in the pond and the creek and the tap water. So even though the water looks the same, it's not the same. That's cool. It's like magical. And then there's one more activity in here, which is to do with erosion and runoff, which is a little bit messy and best done outside, but I will explain it. I'll explain it. So there are a lot of pieces of paper you can crunch up, and this kids can crunch up. Like our topographic map out there, that the landscape has topography, and you can imagine how, when it rains, where's the water going to go? Right into the stream. And so kids can make their own land form by crunching it up, and then you can put it on down outside, and you can say, okay, if it rains on here, where will the water run off? And they'll usually get that, they might not, but then you can test that. You can test that by taking this ground cinnamon, which looks just like dirt, and sprinkle that on there. And then you can take this rain cloud and rain on it and test where it runs off. Okay? So that shows you like where the creek would be, right? The creek is always at the lowest spot, and the whole thing drains in there. If they spray it too long, it does flatten out. So these are the things in the stream box, and we also try and look at things that are actually living in the water, right? So there are droppers and microscope slides and microscopes and plastic bags, things like that. So you can collect some samples in pretty much anything. You can look at them on the microscopes, and we can set that up if we have time. But that's the stream box. It pretty much depends on there being some living water outside, right? So if there's nothing happening in the stream, there's always stuff in the pond. And just like if you look in this, actually maybe we could pass this too. If you look in here, there's a, there are a lot of things living in there that are nice to look at. And even a snail, right, this kids and families, like they can look in the pond and say, oh, yeah, that's a snail. But when you look at that snail crawling under, when you magnify it and make it big and clear, right, people feel really differently about it when they can see its head, its deliberate movements, right, that it's checking things out, maybe it's trying to get out of the light, right, and absolutely magical to do.